Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my cry for help. Please listen and answer me, for I am overwhelmed by my troubles. My enemies shout at me, making loud and wicked threats. They bring trouble on me and angrily hunt me down. My heart pounds in my chest. The terror of death assaults me. Fear and trembling overwhelm me, and I can't stop shaking. Oh, that I had wings like a dove, then I would fly away and rest. I would fly far away to the quiet of the wilderness. But I will call out on God, and the Lord will rescue me. Morning, noon, and night, I cry out in my distress, and the Lord hears my voice. He ransoms me and keeps me safe from the battle waged against me, though many still oppose me. God, who has ruled forever, will hear me and humble them. For my enemies refuse to change their ways, they do not fear God. Give your burdens to the Lord, and he will take care of you. He will not permit the godly to slip and fall. Good morning, or good afternoon, or whenever it is you're watching this again. Good to have you with us for week 3 of being in our feelings. Coming to you live from the beach this time. So we've tried a couple different locations, but I think we're squared away and all good to go here. And really excited to have all of you back with us for week 3. We got just a few weeks left to go, 2 to be exact. And then we'll get back going hopefully here soon all together and have live classes. But as we talked about both weeks we've been together, these are crazy times that we're in. Global pandemic upon us, riots everywhere we turn. It seems like we got bad news. And regardless of whether or not you partake in watching the news or you scroll through social media or whatever it is, the truth of the matter is we all, even without that, have our own stuff. We've got enough on our plates to keep us on our toes. And I'm going to go a step farther and use the word or the emotion that we're going to talk about today, and that is the feeling of stress and anxiety. All the way down to the small things, like, what am I going to wear? Or how do I look? Or what should I say to him, to her? What should I eat? Where should we eat? That's a big one on Sundays. Where we should eat causes a lot of stress. Should I say something to him or to her? Or should I go this way, that way, over there, over yonder? In the words of the great Seinfeld, one of my favorite scenes from my favorite show, um, man, we look stressed and we are stressed to the max. We're stressed people even over small things. But what about the big things, the big stuff, like our families and our kids and our jobs, social media, and money and retirement and insurance and our health and our career and our career choices and the decisions we make on an everyday basis and the bills that we have to pay. Once again, in the words of the great Seinfeld, we look a little stressed about those things too, and we are stressed. And so let me ask you, has there ever been a time in the history of the world where we are more stressed and anxious than we are right now? See, I wish this was a question that we could ask live and get some feedback. And I would argue that there's not been. If you're watching this, it's very likely that something is on your mind that is causing you stress or anxiety. And so today we're going to talk about those things. We're going to stick with David and talking about our stress and our anxiety and how he dealt with that and how we can, um, change the way that we deal with those anxieties and those stresses as we move forward. So to be in our feelings. But remember, though, we talked of these feelings as taking us somewhere. Every week we've talked about stepping into the vehicle. So what does this look like for you? Where, when you step into the vehicle of stress and anxiety, where does it take you? Where does it lead you? And ultimately, this is the question that you have to answer with every feeling, to be in your feeling, to have control over where we go with those feelings and move us then into a better relationship with God. And honestly, this may be a part where you want to pause and maybe write something out. I feel like if you just kind of meander through these two questions on the screen, um, you miss the point of making a change with how we handle and how we deal with our emotions. So I want to challenge you to pause right here, write something down. When you feel stress, when you feel anxiety, where does it take you? Where does it lead you? If you're with somebody, maybe you want to talk it through. As I wrote down some of my thoughts, I couldn't help but think on where I'm at right now. Megan, my wife, is due next month for our first child together. And it was an anxiety, it was a big stress of ours just getting pregnant, just getting to this point to receive this blessing of a child together. And a lot of what ifs came into the equation. And now here we are a month away, and a lot of what ifs have crept in again, and we've gone down that rabbit hole. And I think it's crazy the tools that Satan has at his disposal, like what if, that can cause us to move and jump in this vehicle and move away from a better relationship with God. We feel the stress, we feel the anxiety of what if, and move farther away from Him. And so, with that, I want to look at our man David. It's already been read to you, some of Psalm chapter 55, to get your brain moving in that direction at the beginning. But I want to look at David and how he handles stress, how we should handle our anxieties, and we're going to look to him and how he did it. And to begin with, verses 1 and 2, right off the bat, David says here, "I'm overwhelmed by my troubles. I'm stressed and I'm anxious." And he's going to identify what some of those troubles are. But I want you to notice something out of the gate here, just like we saw last week, and David being upfront and honest about his sin. He's very upfront and honest about being anxious and feeling stress. And he says that. And so David's not playing pretend like we so often choose to do. I think we need to pick up on that. He's putting himself out there. He's calling his stress and his anxiety exactly what it is. He's not beating around the bush, and he's not playing pretend. He's not living in that land of unicorns and princesses. And we might say, well, that's easy for him to be that way. That's hard for me to be so vulnerable with my stress and my anxiety. But with what you know about David, why would it have been especially hard for him to be the way that we read about and be vulnerable, to be emotional and be in his feelings at all? Why would that be actually really hard for him? I mean, I don't know if all your thoughts on him are the way that I think. And again, I wish I could have your feedback here. You're stuck with my thoughts, but I almost always immediately, when I think of David, jump to the story of Goliath. And to think of David as being stressed or overwhelmed or anxious in that moment and in that story is hard to imagine, and it's hard to picture. If you recall that story, do you recall, do you recollect at any point in that story where David appears to be stressed or anxious or worried or overwhelmed about what's at hand? I don't either. Everybody else was. Everybody else was going crazy. Everybody else was stressed. But David walks up, grabs a few stones in a slingshot, and says, "Today, I'm going to kill you and I'm going to cut your head off. You're going to die." And that's what he does. Now, can you imagine the reputation that came with that onto David? Was it that of being vulnerable and in his feelings as we read about in Psalms, I think it's important for us to understand that what we read of David is perhaps the complete opposite of his reputation. I mean, you're talking about a man's man here. Yeah, I'm not sure about you, but I think this is huge for me to understand, not just for myself, but the way that I dish it out too, and how people feel, and the way that they feel stressed and anxious. And my response to them, to my wife, come on, Megan, remember, don't feel that way. We talked about that. Feel this way. Play pretend. Live between those lines of okay and great and good. It's important for me to understand that like David, feeling overwhelmed is not abnormal. It's human to feel that way. There's no shame that should come from us talking about those feelings and calling them what they are. And the truth is, there are going to be times where we can step up and we can face those feelings head on and we can dominate them just like David did Goliath. But then there are also times in our lives, and I'm sure you can relate and think of some, where you just can't. You need help. And like David, you realize I can't go at this alone, and I can't do this anymore. I can't carry this weight around. I thought I could, but I can't. I'm not strong enough, not brave enough, not smart enough. I can't do this anymore. And you know what the worst thing that you can do is ignore that check engine light. We talked about that too. Keep driving in the wrong direction and say, "Ah, well, I do have this," even though you can't. You see that's not strong. That's not brave. That's not smart to do that. There's no courage in playing pretend all the time. That's easy. And so David says there in verse 1, listen to my cries for help. Don't ignore my plea. And what we see is the root of those cries were uncontrollable things that were happening all around him. And to me, that sounds like a really good recipe for stress and anxiety. It almost always comes up that we feel that way when we lose control, we lose power, and we're vulnerable and we feel weak. It almost always comes from me, and it comes on strong for me when it's a situation, when it's a person or something at work, and I can't put my hands on it, I can't control it, and that's what causes me the stress and anxiety. So I have a little surprise for you. I think that the question I would normally ask here, what I would, what I would present you is to say something along the lines of okay, well, what does this look like? Um, but I don't want to do what does this look like. I want to do what does this sound like? And I'm going to disappear for a minute, and I know you can see what's on the screen, but we're just going to leave it there. And you see, I think that honestly, it's usually things that start out small, our anxiety and our stress, and then it gets louder and gets a little bit louder, and soon it just jumps on everything in our life. And it's just always there, and it's always stuck in our head, and it's this noise or others that wakes us up at night. It goes with us to work, to home, to church, the bills, the retirement account, the crash of the stock market, our health, our finances, all these reminders that we're not the ones in control, and the volume is so high that you can't even get through your day. Is this where you are? Not what it looks like, but what it sounds like. Maybe it's affected you um, so much that it's literally affected everything around you. So David, back to David, and I hope that that noise didn't stress you out. But we know the noise was turned way up in David's life, and so he prays. And the first thing that he prays is that in his prayers that he shifts his praying from the really generic and the vague to the specific. And so maybe another time to stop here when I ask you, how does this, what you see on the screen, how does that help exactly? When I shift my praying from praying something generic to something specific, um, what happens? What are the advantages of that when it comes to the anxieties and the stresses in our life? Now, I'm not sure about you, but when I pray specifically, it allows me to turn that volume down, to get those things out of my life, to, as we read about in Hebrews, cast my anxieties on him, or as we remember the passage in Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 through 7. Don't be anxious about everything, but in every situation, little, big, medium, small, doesn't matter, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And verse 7, so when and if I do that, and I pray specifically, what will happen? Well, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So specifically, what did David pray or specify was an anxiety for him? As you look in verses 3 through 5, and I make myself really tiny here. As you look in verses 3 through 5 in Psalms, is this specific enough? I think that as you read through some of this, and he calls things exactly what they are, and he's very specific. As you read verses 3 through 5, one of the other things that I want you to see um, is that his prayers are really honest, and that honestly, I think that sometimes we think that a really spiritual prayer and spiritual lingo is what is honest, but that's not what we see here. We've had classes before, high voltage prayer and praying big bold prayers, but I think if you're like me, I still get caught up sometimes in praying these spiritual prayers that are scripted and they're vague by nature. But David doesn't do that. And as you look at verses 3 through 5, he talks about the people around him bringing their anger to him. Some versions say they hunt him down, they attack him. It's a pretty honest prayer. And although he doesn't name specifically anyone by name, I'll bet we could. I'll bet if I asked you what your anxieties are, a good number of you would not mention something, but rather mention someone. You could literally specifically mention someone's name. But what is it about that name that causes you the anxiety? Well, the answer, I think, is usually pretty easy, and that's that we can't control them. Because I can't control them, because I can't get them to do what I want them to do, it causes me anxiety. How many times have you said, "Wow, if he would just do what he's supposed to do, if she would just do that instead of the other." Just like what we see with David, there's this great connection between what or who, in this case, we cannot control, and the anxiety that we then feel. So let me ask you, is it a family relationship? Is it a friendship? Is it someone at work? Is it a situation where you've been excluded? There's a lot of who's in our lives that this could be, but we've got to understand that there's a lot of things in our life that are out of our control. But here's the truth of the matter. The more we try to control them, whoever them is, the more they push away. And the more that you're pushed away, the more anxiety you feel. And I want you to see and notice that this is a never ending cycle. And if you've been in this cycle, you know that it can lead you down the rabbit hole of what if. All the what if questions that can roll through our mind when I try to control, but I can't, and then I'm pushed away, and then I feel more stress. We could be here all day talking about what ifs as parents and spouses and friendships and with coworkers. It doesn't matter who it is. The cycle that you see on the screen is real. The more I try to control, the more I'm pushed away. And the more I'm pushed away, the more anxiety and stress that I feel. It's a real thing. We've got to understand that there's a lot of things that are just outside of our control. And so David talks about this friend in verses 20 and 21 that betrayed him. And we're going to jump all the way there. As he says, the one who was my friend attacks his friends and breaks his promises. His words are slippery like butter, but war is in his heart. His words are smoother than oil. And so David, uh, excuse me, I didn't finish that, but they cut like knives. So David gets a little more specific about who he's talking about here. And we can speculate all we want. But what he's describing is a betrayal from someone that he trusted. It was obviously someone that was close to him, someone that he thought he could count on. And I want you to think about that for the another way that we're stressed and anxious. Maybe a good time again to stop here and talk about the anxieties that come when someone breaks the trust. You can talk about it from the standpoint of husband and wife, parent and child, boss and employee, a friendship, doesn't matter. This is tough and it cuts deep for a lot of people. The one person that you trusted the most breaks that trust, and the person closest to you betrays. So if that person does that, then now how can I ever trust again? How can I ever count on anybody again? That's a total stress and anxiety in and of itself. This one David is now talking about can be huge for us. And if it was something that happened early in life, it's very likely that you understand how hard it is to get this anxiety off you, this specific stress. Could have been as a child where that person, your mom or dad, that you thought you could count on, walked out. And I'm sure that most of you watching this know this already, but my parents, when we were younger, decided to do foster care while we were growing up. And it was amazing to see the kids that were my age that were put into this category at such a young age. Kids that would be in and out of our house and always anxious and stressed about who they could trust because the person closest to them broke that trust from the very beginning. So David, back to David, in verses 6 through 8, talks about the way that he wants to deal with the anxiety he feels. For most of us, I think we can relate because we all want to relieve these stresses and anxieties as you read this by going away. If I just go here, all of this will go away. Getting away from the noise. So, have you ever felt like this? I think of Forrest Gump and Jenny in that movie, Forrest Gump, and they're little, and Jenny takes Forrest out into the crops and prays that prayer. God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far, far from here. And she repeats it over and over and over. And so David says the same thing here in verses 6 through 8. I wish I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and rest. I would wander far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of escape, far away from the wind and the storm. There's another translation from the message that goes and sounds a lot more like a country song. Get me out of here on dove wings. I want some peace and quiet. I want to walk in the country. I want a cabin in the woods. I'm desperate for a change from rage and stormy weather. Sounds like David's gone a little Garth Brooks on us, but I want to just walk in the country. I want a cabin in the woods. I want it quiet. Just get me away. But then in verses 16 and 17, we've seen that honesty about this anxiety and his stress, and he's pulling over with this feeling. He's pulling over to the side of the road to check that check engine light. And now instead of moving him towards the deep and the dark hole in the land of what ifs and depression and where anxiety and stress can take us, he doesn't. He moves to a place of peace. And as you read verses 16 through 17, it says, but I will call to God for help, and the Lord will save me. Morning, noon, and night I'm troubled and upset, but he will listen to me. I think if we care to be in our feelings and reduce our anxiety, reduce our stress, find a break from the noise and find that cabin in the woods, find that peace that's talked about, then here it is. David says that you can find it through calling on him morning, noon, and night. That equals peace. That's where we find it. I can't help but think about how often I take the stance and I just feel like I can turn my stresses on and off like this light switch that's here behind me. But that's not the way that it is. I can't do that. We know that that isn't the way to peace and getting rid of feeling stressed and anxious all the time. We know that, and David tells us that. The feeling of anxiety and stress should move us to where? Well, to call on Him morning, noon, and night. Not every so often, not every once in a while, not in an on and off fashion like a light switch. Morning, noon, and night. Well, why? Well, that's where He will listen to me. That's where I find the saving. That's where He is. That's where I can find my cabin in the woods. Isn't it interesting though that we do the complete opposite, or maybe I do the complete opposite. In that morning, noon, and night, I start in my day by turning on the noise and turning the volume up by watching the news or scrolling through social media and filling myself up with things that cause me stress. Looking at my calendar and unfortunately seeing that I didn't finish something yesterday, and then I got something to do that's really big today and tomorrow and the day after that, and it never ends. Morning, noon, and night, I remind myself and fill myself with all the stresses and anxieties. But as is the standard in Psalms, I want you to notice, and we talked a little bit, or I did last time I taught on Don't Give Up, um, that honestly, with our stresses and our anxieties, as we see David do in verse 16, it's like he goes from praying to preaching to himself, and it's pretty cool when you pull this apart. That in verses 16 through 19, forget all that anxiety, forget all the stress, forget all the bad. God will do this. As you see, verse 16, He will save me. Verse 17, He will listen to me. Verse 18, He keeps me safe in battle. Verse 19, God who lives forever will hear me. He will punish them. It's interesting. With this feeling and emotion of anxiety and stress, as well as I do that sometimes it feels like the water is rising on us. It can feel like we're drowning and that we have no hope, and it's overwhelming. But I think that we need to understand that if we will, but morning, noon, and night, focus on Him, worship Him, praise Him, and you remind yourself who He is and follow what David says in verse 22. Give your worries to the Lord, and He will take care of you. He'll not let good people down. That's how you drown out that noise. That feeling you've had when you've had a tough week and you show up on a Sunday morning and you leave out of there refreshed, rejuvenated, you feel rescued, you feel listened to, you feel saved. That's what we're talking about. Having that feeling all the time, not just on Sundays. That's being in your feelings. It doesn't mean that you won't have stresses, that you won't have anxieties. You will. That comes with living on this earth. That's part of it. But notice what it does say is that He will take care of you. You see, same with all the other feelings that we have, and we'll discuss the next one next week. It's not, hey, quit feeling that way, feel this way. It's not that. It's morning, noon, night. if I turn up the volume on my worship to Him and what He can do and what He will do, David says He'll take care of you. You care to have those stresses, those anxieties melt away? It's not on and off. It's not done in that fashion. It's morning, noon, and night. I'll see you next week.